After shortly before midday, the empire he had hoped to build had been...
We made the deal. They came out and they
and
dropped a
shoot
load of
down
bombs.
incoming rocket and mortar fires, additional spikes.
Imagine trying to negotiate the most important deal of your life. But there's a catch. You are not allowed to look at, speak to, or be in the same room as the person you are negotiating with. This isn't a hypothetical. This is exactly how the United States and Iran have conducted their highest-stakes diplomatic talks in recent years. Two bitter adversaries sitting in separate hotel rooms in places like Doha, Qatar, or Muscat, Oman, while diplomats scurry down the hallways passing notes back and forth. Why? Because officially, Washington and Tehran don't talk. They haven't had formal diplomatic relations since 1980. Yet, despite the rhetoric, the sanctions, and the decades of shadow wars, a decision did come from these recent backdoor talks. It wasn't signed on a fancy piece of parchment, and there was no televised handshake on the White House lawn. Instead, it was an unwritten, fragile understanding. Today, we are going to break down the decision that came from the U.S.-Iran talks. We're going to look at what both sides agreed to, why they did it, and most importantly, why you, sitting at home in the United States, need to care. Because this quiet agreement impacts gas prices, the safety of American troops, and the balance of power across the globe. To understand the decision that was made, we have to rewind the clock. Don't worry, we won't go all the way back to the 1950s. Let's just look at the last 10 years. 2015, the JCPOA. In 2015, the U.S., along with world powers, signed the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. The concept was simple. Iran stops building a nuclear bomb, and in exchange, the U.S. and others lift crippling economic sanctions. For a brief moment, tensions cooled, but in Washington, the deal was highly controversial. Critics argued it didn't do enough to stop Iran from funding proxy militias across the Middle East, and that its restrictions on Iran's nuclear program had an expiration date. 2018, the U.S. officially withdrawing from the deal. In 2018, the United States pulled out of the deal and slapped maximum pressure sanctions back on Iran. Iran's economy tanked, but in response, Tehran didn't cave. Instead, they hit the gas pedal on their nuclear program. Uranium enrichment is a numbers game. To power a civilian nuclear reactor, you need uranium enriched to about 3.6%. To build a nuclear bomb, you need 90%. By the time recent backdoor talks began, Iran was enriching uranium to 60%. They were weeks, maybe days away from having enough fissile material for a weapon. Meanwhile, the Middle East was becoming a powder keg. Iranian-backed proxy groups were taking potshots at U.S. military bases in Iraq and Syria. Washington realized they had a massive problem. The U.S. is currently focused on major global challenges, supporting allies in Eastern Europe against Russia and countering China's rise in the Indo-Pacific. The last thing American military planners wanted was to get dragged into a messy, unpredictable, and costly war in the Middle East. So the U.S. needed a pause button, and Iran, dealing with massive protests at home and an economy crushed by inflation, desperately needed cash. The stage was set. The middlemen were called. It was time to make a deal. So what exactly was the decision that came out of these indirect talks? Foreign policy experts call it an unwritten understanding or a de-escalation agreement. It was built on three main pillars. Pillar number one, the nuclear cap. The U.S. demanded that Iran stop enriching uranium at 60%. They didn't ask Iran to dismantle their entire program. That ship had sailed. But they drew a hard line in the sand. Do not go to 90%. Do not cross the threshold of weapons-grade material. In exchange, the U.S. agreed not to pile on any new devastating sanctions. Pillar number two was the most emotional and the most controversial part of the decision, the prisoner swap. Iran was holding several Iranian-American dual citizens on charges of espionage, charges the U.S. government and their families completely denied, viewing them as political hostages. To get them home, a complex financial gymnastics routine had to take place. South Korea owed Iran about $6 billion for oil they had purchased years ago, but the money was frozen due to U.S. sanctions. The decision allowed that $6 billion to be unfrozen and transferred to a heavily monitored bank account in Qatar. Here is the catch, and this is heavily debated in U.S. politics. The U.S. stipulated that Iran could only use this money for humanitarian goods, food, medicine, agricultural products. The U.S. Treasury Department would have eyes on every single transaction. Critics in the U.S. immediately slammed this. Their argument? Money is fungible. Even if the $6 billion is strictly used for food, it frees up $6 billion in Iran's regular budget that they can use to fund their military or proxy groups. Proponents of the deal countered that leaving American citizens to rot in a foreign prison was unacceptable, and that the U.S. didn't actually hand over American taxpayer dollars. It was Iran's own oil money. Pillar number 3, reining in the shadow war. The U.S. demanded that Iran tell its proxy militias in Iraq and Syria to stop firing rockets and launching drones at American troops. For the U.S., this was non-negotiable. American lives were at risk daily. In return, the U.S. would unofficially agree to look the other way on some of Iran's oil exports, allowing them to sell more oil, primarily to China, keeping the Iranian economy on life support. So, a cap on nukes, a prisoner swap for frozen funds, and a ceasefire on U.S. troops. That was the decision. It wasn't a permanent peace treaty. It was a lid placed on a boiling pot to keep it from spilling over. But how does this lid hold up in the real world? And why does it matter to you? Foreign policy can often feel disconnected from our daily lives. It's a bunch of people in suits talking in rooms thousands of miles away. But the decision that came from the U.S.-Iran talks has a direct pipeline to Main Street, USA. Let's break down exactly how. First, the price at the pump. About 20 to 30% of the world's oil consumption passes through the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow waterway right off the coast of Iran. When the U.S. and Iran are on the brink of war, oil markets panic, insurance rates for oil tankers skyrocket, and what happens when global oil markets panic? Gas prices in the United States go up. Whether you live in Texas, Ohio, or California, a hot war with Iran means you are paying significantly more to fill up your car, and groceries cost more because shipping costs increase. The de-escalation decision was meant to keep those shipping lanes quiet and global markets stable. Second, American lives. There are still thousands of American service members deployed in the Middle East, primarily in non-combat advisory roles in Iraq and Syria, keeping remnants of ISIS at bay. These bases are highly vulnerable to drone and rocket attacks from Iranian-backed militias. For military families across America, the unwritten agreement to stop proxy attacks meant breathing a little easier. When the agreement holds, American soldiers are safer. When it breaks down, as we've seen during flare-ups and regional violence, those troops are right in the crosshairs. Third, the global chessboard. The United States military and intelligence communities only have so much bandwidth. Right now, Washington views its primary long-term competitor as China, and its most immediate security threat as the ongoing war in Eastern Europe. Every dollar, every carrier strike group, and every hour of presidential attention spent managing a crisis with Iran is attention pulled away from Beijing and Moscow. The decision to establish a quiet truce with Iran was a strategic choice by the U.S. government. It was an attempt to put the Middle East on the back burner so America could focus its resources on great power competition. But here is the harsh reality of the decision. It was written in pencil, not in ink. Because it's an unwritten understanding, it is incredibly fragile. It doesn't have the force of a treaty ratified by the U.S. Senate. It is highly dependent on the political climate. A new U.S. president taking office can completely change the strategy on day one.
A sudden regime change in Iran could scrap the deal overnight. And as we've seen with sudden outbreaks of war and violence in the Middle East, a regional crisis can force both sides to abandon de-escalation in a heartbeat. If Iran's allies go to war, or if U.S. allies are attacked, the quiet handshake vanishes. The decision that came from the U.S.-Iran talks wasn't meant to make the two nations friends. It wasn't meant to solve a decades-old ideological feud. It was a pragmatic, cold-blooded calculation by both sides. For Iran, it was about survival and cash. For the United States, it was about keeping the nuclear genie in the bottle, bringing Americans home, and keeping the global economy stable while dealing with bigger geopolitical threats. It is a Band-Aid on a deep geopolitical wound, but in the world of international relations, sometimes a Band-Aid is the best you can get. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. If you want to understand more about how global events impact our lives here at home, hit the like button, subscribe, and let us know in the comments. Do you think the U.S. should continue these quiet negotiations with Iran, or is it time for a different approach? Stay informed, and we'll see you in the next one.